Welcome back to the scriptorium. This is program number 17, and we're still on plate 18, the Roman capitals. We weren't able to finish the series last time, so let's begin with the third width group again with the B. Knifing to the right at the top, you knife over to the right at the bottom, just above the writing line. Go into the wet ink to the left, and then with the edge angle, about 15 degrees, you go over and come up into a hairline. Go to the top, shoulder it just slightly, that is dip and rise, and then very slightly steepen the edge angle as you come down, and then put this horizontal bar in, just resting on the center. That is, this would be halfway between the writing line and the cap line. And then start the bowl, and the bowl will be a little wider than the one above. You manage to meet that point down there by focusing your eyes on it and using peripheral vision on the pen. You'll find if you practice that, that will enable you always to come to the point where you want to. The E begins the same way the B did, with that knifing to the right. You come down, pulling from the shoulder with a large pen, and then just above the writing line, knife over to the right. Go into the wet ink again, go to the left, and then with the thinner stroke, move over to the right, and then up. Go into the wet ink at the top, and to keep the letter lively, just the slightest suggestion of a reverse curve, and then rotate on the upper corner and put the serif in, resting on the center so that the lower counter will be a little bigger than the upper counter. Put the second arm in. Now, these three arms should be optically of equal length. Be very careful that the bottom, where this hairline begins, that this is not to the right of the point at the top. They must seem to line up vertically. F begins the way E does, except when you get down and knife to the right, you go back into the wet ink and put in this serif, which we've been examining, the serif which is just a slight shape like that, a cusp. And that completes this foot serif, which should be done with a very flat pen and kept quite narrow so that there's no danger of it getting so wide that the reader might think that it's an E that you're writing. Now, because of the great space underneath here, we lower the second arm and put it just under the midpoint, and you may or may not put that serif on. The J is one of the letters the Romans didn't have. J, K, U, and W were not Roman letters during the Imperium. When you get down below the line, I like to go down a little bit to the right and then come back up to give a slightly strong lozenge shape to that accent. J and I were the same letter. J and I, either one could be vowel or consonant right up until the change was started around 1526 or so. And it took a long time for it to be accepted. And even today, I understand that the British Museum has no part in the card catalog for J. If you want to look up Johnson, you have to look under the I's. In the same way with the U, you would have to look under the V's, because those two letters, the U and the V, were the same letter. One later, I became the vowel, J the consonant, and then U became the vowel, and V the consonant. Well, the next letter after J would be the L. And it is finished much the way E is. P. A foot serif like the one on F. And a bowl like the one on B, except that it comes down just below the center. The R, very much like the P in the upper part. Move this over. Foot serif like that on F, P. And then you shoulder this up slightly, and it puts a little more vitality into it, and with B, straighten the edge angle as you come down toward where the center line will be. This rests just below the center. And then where the horizontal meets the bowl, put the diagonal in, and as you finish the diagonal, flatten the edge angle, and you get an elegant, classic-looking letter. S is the next one, and you worked on S before. The serif at the head, top arm and the bottom arm is the only addition. We generally leave the bottom arm unserifed because the eye watches the top. Now, the next group, well, we might put poor little I. And I, it has no family. It's all by itself. But it's like the first strokes, last strokes of H. Then come the big letters, letters that are wider than they are tall, the M. And it's finished the way you finish the first stroke of A or the first stroke of M. Don't try to put the serif in as you get to the line, but lift the pen, go into the wet ink, lay it flat, and then draw that with the corner of the pen. Come over horizontally. Don't let it droop under any circumstances. With the corner of the pen, draw the fillet in so that you'll have just the width of the pen there for the downstroke. And the serif goes with the downstroke, as it does on M. Now get a central V that is wide, because that's where the width of M comes from, is the great width of that central V. Lengthen that so you can use a very flat pen angle and get a nice serif on that upper corner. Now watch the first counter, and with peripheral vision, make the second counter the same width as the first one. It's a beautiful letter, and with practice, you'll find you can get the letter you want. Now, W is just as wide as M, but where the first and third strokes on M are not parallel, they are on W, as we'll see here. It's two V's. They were still called U in Queen Elizabeth's time, and that's why we call it W, as the French will call it double V. Lay the same sort of serif in. Get the fillets drawn up in the corner. Now try to get this parallel to the first stroke, but watch that. See, being a double, this 1 and 3 will be parallel, and 2 and 4 will be parallel. Whereas with the M, 1 and 3 are not parallel at all, you see, and 2 and 4 are not parallel. M is not an upside down W. If we look here, we'll see that M does not look at all the way the W did. In very few typefaces, you'll find that M looks like an upside down W, and I think it's very ugly that way. Well, let's go visit one of the elementary schools now and see these wonderful children at work with their alphabet.
This is a pen just like yours, only a little larger. Okay, I'm going to be using this. Your lines are written for 4 to 5 pen widths, which is what Italic is written on. And see, I'm going to make marks here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these lines are perfect for my pen, just as your lines are perfect for your pen to write Italic with. I'm going to hold mine at a 45-degree angle, just like you do when you write. And so I make a thin like this, and then my downstroke will be thick. I'll do an end to show you, and it works just the same way as yours does, only a little larger. We're at Catlin Gable School, and my name is Inga Dubé, and we're teaching in the 3rd grade today, and we're using the design stripe pens, which are a felt pen with a chisel tip on it, which allows for making thin and thick lines, just as you would use with the dip pens or the Osmoroid or Platignum, fountain pens. But for smaller children, this is, I think, very advantageous because you don't have the problem of ink and the filling and the spilled ink and that sort of thing. They make it possible to experience the magic of the edge pen. That is, when you hold the pen at a 45-degree angle and write a letter, you can make thin and thick lines, which is really a joy. To see that difference coming where the downstrokes are thick and the upstrokes and the joins are thin and light, and the words take on a new elegance in that the letters themselves are strong and the joins are incidental. My idea is to even maybe start in the middle of the 2nd grade, start in joins as early as possible, so it really gets into their natural hand and just becomes a part of them in a very natural way. That's all right. Just start over again. Just start over again.
I get the greatest pleasure out of visiting these classes of children. That was Inga Dubé at Catlin Gable. She's an excellent teacher and a marvelous calligrapher, one of many marvelous calligraphers and teachers whom we have in this area. Well, let's turn to plate 19 on the problem of single sheet layout. I just like the term layout. I'd rather call it a sheet design or a page design. Layout sounds too mechanical. Now, in going at these, there are certain tools which you need, and I would suggest that you get this 60-30 degree triangle, a celluloid triangle. This is the 30 here and the 60 here. Don't get a 45 one, and get a tall one so that you can draw very long vertical lines on your T-square. And the T-square should be an accurate one. Be sure you don't have one in which the horizontal part is loose on the vertical. I use metal tools, metal rules, metal T-square always, because they're more reliable. But I can't use them in this program because of the way the light reflects and shines and glares off that steel and aluminum. But have at least those two tools. If possible, for this sort of work, get a mechanical drawing set. Now, it doesn't need to be quite this elaborate, but you need a good compass for taking measurements, a compass that can be spread, and then a small one that that has a screw on it here so that you can set it. This is called a set compass, and you need to use this in ruling guidelines because the guidelines, either directly on your paper or guidelines that go underneath your writing, have to be very accurate. And if you take markings off a piece of paper, they aren't going to be as accurate as they are with a pair of set compasses like this. So this is one of the most important tools, I'd say, next to the good 60-30 triangle and a good, solid, reliable T-square. Now, for the single sheet layout, let's look at the text for a minute. One of my very clever students spent an Easter vacation devising the formula for this to find out how to get margins that will give you a text area, which is about 50% of the total area. He devised this formula, which is A plus B minus this distance, and then divided by 6, and that gives 2 units. Your margins then will be 2 units at the top, 3 on each side, and 4 on the bottom, as Edward Johnston advises. And whether it's a horizontal rectangle or a vertical rectangle, the same thing holds. Now, I don't need to demonstrate that, I think, but try it out. And in taking the measurements, use a metric scale, because the metric scale, being divided into tenths, is much easier to use than the old scale, where you may have a problem of dividing or multiplying with, say, 7/16 or 5/8. Use graphic means wherever you can, instead of having to measure. And if you have to measure, get the metric rule. Most drugstores, chain stores, where they have some stationary supplies, will have a ruler now, which is the familiar foot and inch markings on one side and the metric scale on the other. Now, at the bottom of plate 19 here is one of the most useful devices which the graphic art uses. That is, if you have a little rectangle like B, C, D, and A, and want to reduce it or enlarge it so that it's the same proportion between the width and the height, you draw this diagonal. Now, this is the same rectangle proportionately that ABCD is. So this is of great value in reducing, in getting photographs to fit onto into a book, through cropping the photographs, through finding a larger or smaller rectangle for your use in layout. The next one on book design is one of the most important things in this whole book. For a long time, that is, after the invention of printing, in a century or so, the old formula for designing books was lost. It was forgotten. And by the Victorian period, by the 19th century, book design had become a very sorry affair. The margins on each side of the page were of equal width, so that each page was thought of as being separate. Now, William Morris, when he came along, said that the unit is the open book. There should be 2 pages. And he used that. Now, I find that Morris had book layouts, book designs that are very much like the beautiful ones of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the same proportions. How he arrived at those, I don't know, but I think that he studied books which were in the British Museum and then proportionately used the same text areas, the same page sizes, the same pages in regard to proportion, and simply enlarged or decreased the sizes proportionately. The greatest book designer in our time was Jan Tschichold, and you'll see his name here in the text of plate 20. Jan Tschichold was a great, great book designer, and he was dissatisfied with his own book design, and he was enamored of the incredible, beautiful design that was done in the Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance. And he thought that there must be some shop practice, some ancient formula which was used by medieval book designers to give them such beautiful pages. He spent between 25 and 30 years in his spare time measuring books which were in libraries in Europe and discovered what the usual rectangles were in these beautiful medieval books. And he also discovered how they determined the text area, how they determined the size of the margins. And I'd written to Jan Tschichold. Unfortunately, the great man has died recently, but I've written to him, and he gave me permission to use the canon and the diagrams which I've prepared, and he was delighted with the way I'd simplified the approach, because I've taken from his very complex and difficult article from the calligraphy and paleography, which I refer to in the text in plate 19, and I hope you can get a copy of this or see a copy of it. It's out of print, but your library or your teacher may have a copy. And the section on book design comes just 2 essays after the one which I wrote on touch and rhythm. Here's his name, and it's this non-arbitrary proportion of page and type areas. It's an incredibly wonderful contribution to the problem of book design. Now, the most common rectangles in use in the Middle Ages, Tschichold discovered, are this root 2. Now, this may bother you greatly that it's called a root 2. But let's start with a simpler one, the 2 to 3 proportion. First, in working to experiment with this, draw with your T-square a horizontal and then a vertical. Now, mark off 2 units. They can be any units. If you have the compasses, you can mark them off like that. If you don't have the compasses, you may take the marking on a piece of paper, a strip of paper like this. But get the compasses when you can. Here, say, it can be any unit, you see. Take that as 1 unit, and here, double it. Now we have 2 units horizontally, and we want 3 units vertically. This was one of the most popular page proportions or rectangles in the Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance. All of the books done at Mainz by the Gutenberg, Fust, Schaefer firm seem to be done with the 2 to 3 rectangle. So here is that rectangle. Of course, their books often had 2 columns. Now, if you want to design a book like that, and you want a page, but you want it larger than that, we'll draw that diagonal, which we saw in the previous plate, and then, whoops, it slips. In too big a hurry, and you can't be in a hurry with these things. You have to be accurate, and I suggest that you have a 7H pencil, which is very hard and very gray and wouldn't show up here on the paper very well at all. But keep a needle point on that by sharpening it on fine sandpaper. Now, if you decide that you want your rectangle for your book page to be this tall, then all you have to do is to draw a horizontal. And this is the width that it will be if it's going to be in proportion to that small one. It's a larger root 2 rectangle. Now that might be very small for your book, but you can make it any size that you want. Now the root 2 rectangle may puzzle you as to why it's called root 2. First, I'll answer that question in a few minutes. First, draw a square. As you can see in the diagram, I'll use the compasses because they're a little quicker, but you can use the markings on a strip of paper as I showed you. We'll get our square. And that is why you have to have a very good T-square and at least a straight edge along the left side of your writing desk, at least if you're right-handed. Now, in order to get this root 2, you take the measurement of that diagonal this way. Now that, you see, is the diagonal. Now transfer that up until it bisects the vertical. Now draw a horizontal through that and extend the right side, and we have what is called a root 2 rectangle. A very popular and beautiful rectangle. You can make a root 3 one by taking the same approach, use the diagonal, transfer that over until it bisects the vertical, and here is the beautiful, tall, slim root 3 rectangle. And we'll go on with this next time and show you how to use this in your own bookmaking.